And it's just gone 11 o'clock, which means it's time to start today's webinar. Hi there, my name is Danny Chifley. I'm from the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. Today's webinar, Warming Up, Climate Reporting on Community Broadcasting. Climate change is already affecting Australian landscapes and our way of life. Recent impacts include intense winter droughts, the mega bushfires of 2019-2020's Black Summer, and sea level rise in the Torres Strait. The webinar today will introduce Warming Up, a project that aims to explore and support the innovative role played by community radio in climate change communication. Before I get started and introduce today's guests, I'd just like to acknowledge that today's session is being brought to you on Gadigal land, and as such we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, that of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, paying respects to elders past and present. Today's session will be presented by Associate Professor Kerrie Foxwell-Norton and Leitch, Dr. Bridget Backhaus and Professor Brendan Mackey. I believe will also be joining us there in the background. But to say more about all of our wonderful presenters, and because we've got a lot to get through, I'm going to stop talking now and throw it to Kerrie, Anne and Bridget. If you'd like to tell us a bit about yourselves before we get started, it'd be wonderful to have it. And thank you for making yourselves available for today's session.
And could I just ask you to share our screen, our PowerPoint, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Is that showing up? Great.
Yeah. Thanks, CBAA, for having us today, and for everybody who's come along to our webinar today. I'll begin by acknowledging the country that I'm on today, which is Bundjalung country here in far northern New South Wales. I think it's worthwhile just reflecting a little bit on how today's webinar can be understood, or we can reflect that in today's webinar. So I often think about the different relationships to land and sea that our First Nations people have, and the tens and thousands of years of knowledge and expertise that they bring to our understanding of this landscape. And in that spirit, I pay my respects to elders past, present and emergent. Land was never ceded. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the name of this project is called Warming Up, building the capacity of community radio to communicate climate change. There's 4 of us who are working with the community broadcasting sector on this project. There's myself, and could you just please go to the next slide? There's myself, and we all bring different expertise because climate change is such a wicked problem that it requires diverse expertise and multiple disciplines in order to begin to address and to support climate change adaptation and mitigation, which we'll get to later on. So my own background is in environmental communication, media and journalism, but I also did a lot of work with the sector on 2 national surveys of community radio stations and their audiences in the early 2000s. Anne brings her expertise in climate change adaptation and community engagement to the project. Bridget is, of course, a community radio researcher and has extensive experience, both research-linked and practical experience with the community radio sector in Australia and internationally. And Brendan Mackey, amongst other things, is a climate scientist who is also one of the lead authors in the IPCC report Australasia Chapter 11. So he brings that scientific expertise. And together we're being funded by the Griffith Climate Action Beacon, which is a strategic research investment from Griffith University, and also in-kind support from the CBAA, which we're very, very grateful for. Okay, next slide. So this is just an early conversation that we hope to develop over the next years, we hope. And it's based on partnership and co-design with the sector, because as you'll hear repeatedly throughout this presentation, climate change impacts are felt locally and experienced locally, and therefore, we need to foster and empower local responses. So it can't be bottom down, top down. It must be bottom up for us to action climate change and ready our communities. So the broad aims of this project are to map and evaluate the current approaches to climate change communication across the community radio sector, to co-design climate change responses in close collaboration with the community radio sector, including its peak body and its diverse stations and audiences, to build capacity across the sector to discuss climate change and its impacts in locally appropriate ways that develop and facilitate community understanding, resilience and response. We know that these are difficult conversations. We understand some of the challenges that stations and communities face, but we're looking for the subtleties and the nuances of all the places where your stations are at, whether they be defined by interest or geography. Undertake case studies in partnership with community radio stations to develop exemplar resource materials for the sector. So we're looking for stations, individual stations that will work closely with us to develop their own materials that we can then showcase to the rest of the sector. Develop a training program and partner with the community in partnership with the Community Media Training Organisation. So the legacy of the project is not we'll do the work with those stations and then leave. The plan is to develop training resources so that the entire sector can benefit from the work that the initial work that Warming Up is doing, and also building on existing efforts, of course, within the sector that we're about to talk about and we're keen to find out more about. Of course, there's a research component. So, you know, that really deep local engagement that's characteristic of community radio stations is really valuable for government and climate science agencies and community groups on what might be effective climate change responses at a local scale. So finding ways that we can take what we learn from the sector and share that with agencies who are also seeking to foster and importantly fund action on climate change. And finally, to address a gap in an under-researched area of community radio. Next slide, Anna, please. So today's aims, we've only got about 20 minutes of presentation here, and we're all timing ourselves so that we don't run over. Today, we're just going to introduce the project and the background to climate change and community broadcasting, explore how stations could talk about climate change, canvass key opportunities and challenges of climate change for community broadcasting, present some of the existing activities of community broadcasting relevant to climate, begin to identify how tailoring content for diverse audience can ready them for local climate change impacts, advise on credible sources of information on climate change, and really importantly, invite stations to become involved in this project. Next slide, please, Anne. Because for mine and how I arrived at this project was, you know, via that intense engagement with the community radio sector in the early 2000s, and then my own interest in, you know, community-based responses to climate change. So there's this wonderful symmetry that's happening between what is required to foster climate change and what the community radio sector do already. So climate change impacts are experienced locally, and so therefore our responses must be local. Community radio knows local and is representative of the immense cultural and geographical diversity of Australia. The way in which climate change impacts and risks are, and opportunities and challenges are experienced in Bendigo will be different to how it's experienced in Katherine or Melbourne, or, you know, in other places in Australia. So in many ways it's a perfect match. There's also this the democratic participation in media that's characteristic of community radio, and the democratic participation in our responses to climate changes and its impacts. It's also important. And I guess one of the other perfect symmetry for me, but just before I pass over to Anne, is that one of the core challenges of climate change and fostering climate action is communication and understanding. And communication and understanding that must happen at a local level. So therefore, the type of communication and understanding of the local, and that's undertaken by community radio stations and the network of community groups that characterise the sector, is really fertile ground for us to begin to support communities' adaptation and mitigation, and empower stations and their communities to have the sorts of conversations that are required now and certainly into the future. So, and Bridget, actually, I'm passing on to Bridget to tell us what we know so far.
Thanks, Kerrie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm on Turrbal and Yagara country up in Brisbane at the moment. And I want to pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So as Kerrie said, I'm Bridget. I'm the community radio researcher at Griffith. I'm also an ex-volunteer and producer. So I think I do bring a very different perspective to this project, hopefully a useful one. But it is coming onto this project has been a little bit intimidating because I'm obviously working with such impressive climate change researchers. But what I've come to realise as we've moved forward with this is the importance of local context and local storytelling. And that's been something that I learned during my time in the sector, and also something that my own research has kept reinforcing, that local storytelling is so powerful. And that's really at the heart of community radio, telling local stories in local voices. It's what you as broadcasters do every single day, and it's incredibly powerful when it comes to communicating social and environmental change. Of course, it's one thing to wade through statistics and scientific journal articles, but hearing firsthand people's experiences of climate change is very, very different and communicates in a very different way. So what I'd like to talk about is, we know that this kind of storytelling is happening already. We know that it's something that many stations are doing and doing really well. There are so many examples of community radio stations all around the country taking a really leading role in communicating about climate change. And that's what this project really wants to explore and also facilitate more of. It's not us telling you what you should be doing. It's about us learning from you and understanding the unique challenges that you face and working out how we can work together to really support you in this incredibly important role. So as I mentioned, we know there's a lot of great work happening in this space, and I'd like to briefly just talk about the 4 different types of climate change communication that we're already seeing across the sector. So we've got disaster readiness, disaster broadcasting, disaster recovery, and climate change content. So some of these topics might sound familiar to some of you, and if you are doing similar work at your station, or if you're doing something completely different, we'd really love to hear about it. So please do post on the chat or join in the discussion later. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. So first, disaster readiness. Thanks, Anne. Our gracious hosts and collaborators, the CBAA, are really working hard in this capacity across several fronts. First, in training, a lot of you may have already seen that the CBAA has recently launched, or is launching very soon, an online training module about disaster readiness. The CMTO also has a 1-day emergency preparedness training course available, and these were both developed based on the experiences of broadcasters and station managers who have actually been involved in this kind of disaster broadcasting. So there is training available to help stations prepare for these disaster situations. Jump to the next slide, please, Anne. There's also infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, which is, of course, very important. You need the infrastructure to be able to engage in these broadcasts. Several stations have recently built new transmitters, either to replace damaged equipment or extend their broadcasting range. And these kind of infrastructure projects are not the most glamorous kind of climate change thing, but they are incredibly important when it comes to disaster readiness, because these are the kinds of things that you don't want to be dealing with when you're in this disaster situation. You need to be ready to go and ready to broadcast straight away. So securing these sorts of investments is important. The next area is disaster broadcasting. And this is, I mean, Braidwood is one of the very high profile examples we've had recently. It's probably the most visible form of climate change communication that we have in the sector. There are lots of stations involved in disaster broadcasting, of course, but I'll talk briefly about Braidwood FM. If any of you were at the CBAA conference recently, there was a fantastic emergency broadcasting panel. And if you were there, you'd be familiar with the work of Gordon Waters and Braidwood FM during the Black Summer bushfires. They did the most incredible job in the most terrifying of circumstances, just broadcasting that essential information to keep their communities safe. The conditions were horrendous and rapidly changing, and the station pulled together 2 weeks of near continuous coverage of the situation, the evolving situation in the Talaganda National Park. And as you can see from in this quote, which is from the submission into the Royal Commission, their efforts were really appreciated by the local community. They dropped off food and gifts to thank the volunteers. And we also saw some of the direct benefits of the disaster readiness work I mentioned earlier. And that was this increased broadcast range, which really allowed the station to access these quite remote and rural areas who would have no idea what was going on if not for Braidwood FM. Of course, this is just one example of the many stations who found themselves inadvertently in this disaster broadcasting role throughout Black Summer. Stations across Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, they all became information lifelines for their communities, keeping listeners up to date with the latest information and updates from the Rural Fire Service. And this is, of course, just one example. I mean, the same thing happens with floods and cyclones all over the country. And it's this sort of local knowledge and insight of the broadcasters that is really invaluable in these situations. It literally saves lives. Next, we have disaster recovery. And this is, I guess, almost a lesser known kind of role of community radio in climate change broadcasting. Many stations are involved in this again, and I'll just briefly talk about one. That's Triple T in Townsville in the wake of the January 2019 floods. They took a real leading community role in the recovery efforts. They obviously did the sharing of information about how to access different services and disposal points, you know, which dumps were open to receive flood damaged goods, also providing information about financial assistance and insurance, which was particularly important in that case because the rules and eligibility criteria actually changed midway through the disaster. So having the most important, most up-to-date information was really important. But what I thought was interesting about the Triple T case is that they actually took quite a holistic view of this disaster recovery and actually broadcast a lot of mental health and wellbeing services, holding events with service providers, broadcasting information about, oops, sorry, that's my timer going off. I've spoken for too long. I'll be really quick now, sorry, Kerrie. They were also involved in economic recovery as well, making donations to flood relief and also sharing the success stories of their super volunteers, which was great as well. The final area, I'm going to wrap it up really quickly, is climate change content. And obviously this is something that a lot of you will be familiar with. We have the formal initiatives like podcasts. I'm sure you're all familiar with From the Embers, the amazing podcast supported by the CBAA. This was quite a well-funded, well-supported big initiative, but we also have sort of individual stations doing formal initiatives like the Making a Climate Emergency Declaration, like the Pulse in Geelong. Next slide, please, Anne. The formal initiatives are very important, but we also have regular environmental programming. These are shows that really focus on this kind of environmental angle. We've got the Sustainable Hour on the Pulse, Earth Matters on 3CR, but this also kind of involves general programming that includes an environmental aspect. And this was something that emerged from some of our kind of initial discussions with stations, was this show The A to Z of Everything on CHY in COFs. They're two teenagers that run a general content show, but they're regularly engaging in conversations about climate change and what it means to them and their community. And finally, I'm finishing now, I promise. Finally are the community conversations that come up across everyday content. Because of course, talking about climate change is not always about planned programming. It's about tapping into the conversations that are already taking place, whether you've been chatting with listeners who dial in or the discussions that take place in your community. And these are different wherever you go. There's a couple of examples on the screen there of some of the conversations that we've been hearing. But that's obviously a very brief overview. Last slide, I promise. Thanks, Anne. So as we can see from this very brief, very rushed overview, we can see that climate change broadcasting is a really diverse, really broad area. It's so much more than just disaster broadcasting. The effects of climate change are experienced locally, so they need to be talked about in ways that are appropriate to local communities. And a lot of these conversations end with the questions, what can I do? What can we do? And by facilitating these conversations through content, you're supporting your communities to learn and take action. So the next step here is how station management and the sector and us through this project is how we can support you in this final role. And now I will finally stop talking and turn over to Anne. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I'm Anelich. I'm coming to you from the other end of Bundjalung country to Kerrie, or at least maybe not quite the other end, but close. So I'd also like to pay my respects to the past and present and emerging leaders on this incredible part of the country, which was known for its fertility and great bounty for Indigenous peoples over the past few millennia. So I'm the reader of scientific literature that has to try and kind of distill the gems out of this. And increasingly, because I've also had a long interest in community engagement too, I'm continually frustrated by the gap between what scientists are printing and what is then filtering through to be useful to communities in terms of decision making. And climate change in the early days was very much cast as polar bears and ice. And in Australia, climate change doesn't look like that. Climate change is drought, bushfire, flood, it's coastal erosion, it's heat islands in cities. It's a whole myriad of things that are a long way from polar ice caps, even though that influence is very important. And so to be able to have effective conversations with the community about these sorts of impacts, we need to start shifting the conversation from the global to the local. We need to also convey not just the urgency, but which can create panic, which puts people into a mode of feeling that they can't do anything. But we need to convey that, the actions of individuals are important. Your actions are never too small to make a difference. You can do things that make more of a difference than others. But it's climate change is basically already here, and we need to be doing things now. And certainly having conversations and influencing others to do things now too. It's already impacting us as individuals. I think, that was very real. Like, we've had glimpses of it before now, but this summer was very real in terms of, the bushfires that we saw impacting us as individuals, as families, and also, flowing onto the livelihoods of whole communities and the country through that. And these kind of are very complex webs of social, economic, and environmental interconnections that the climate drives a lot of this stuff. But also really important, and this is where community radio can play such an important role, is how local community, particularly in terms of local knowledge about what's happening on the ground and what the best solutions are, and how we can engage all those people to develop solutions for the things that are happening for them locally. So this is a classic example of, what is climate change. We see a lot of these things all the time about what the climate risks are: extreme weather, loss of species, water availability, people, sea level rise, cost, food, oceans, coral bleaching. And all these things are important, but it just highlights the remoteness often of the global forecasts and what's happening. So these are the sorts of things that through this project we're hoping to kind of help you think about how these kind of flow through to the local impact at the local level, because if you're living in Bourke, then sea level rise isn't going to be an issue. But water availability is. So, to help you think through what your local impacts are and how you can have community conversations about those. It's also good to have an understanding of climate change responses too. And we hear a lot about mitigation, a lot about reducing emissions, because they're the big top-down things often. It's energy policy, it's agricultural policy, it's transport policy. And so that while there are things that we can do, they're the things that government often plays a leading role in structuring. And then there's adaptation, which is about managing those impacts. And so that also links to government policy, but it's a lot of things that we can do on the ground in terms of managing bushfires, managing floods, coastal erosion, managing urban heat islands, and all of that sorts of things. We can look at those, at how we respond to those risks. And the overlapping here, that's having a healthy environment, and it's also having the community take action too, and having an engaged community. Climate change also exacerbates everything else. If there's a problem, climate change is going to make it worse. So things like air pollution, heat, land use change, invasive species, grazing, fire, storm damage, coastal development. And now we can also add pandemics to that. You know, climate change is going to magnify all of these things. And I was recently reading some interesting stuff about how volcanoes affect climate change too, and that's not quite the way in which we thought. So, you know, all the time there's kind of new twists and turns in the whole climate change puzzle that we're learning more about. Luckily, we don't have too many volcanoes here anymore. But and often I hear from local people that they don't know where to go to for information. There's lots of people get their information from Facebook, other social media, and that becomes their truth. But I think what we can do is provide you with some authoritative sources that hopefully can help you understand what authoritative sources look like, and help put some reliable information into the climate change conversations. And this is just a list of useful things that we can talk more about through the project. I'm just going to pass back to Kerrie again to talk about challenges and opportunities.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Bridget. So in discussing climate change communication and what's required in terms of communication and understanding, we're very conscious that the challenges are often scientifically defined. You know, it's about various temperature rises in degrees. It's about sea level rises. But really, the core challenges, a lot of the science is in. And very much developed, but the core challenges that we face really are socially and culturally defined. And because community radio stations are very much a social and cultural resource in their communities, they're really perfectly poised to be able to help us address that core challenge of how do we engage with the social and cultural characteristics of a community in ways that make climate change, its risks, its impacts, its opportunities and challenges mean locally. It has to be meaningful for local people, otherwise it doesn't, it won't fly. And back to Bridget's earlier point about the powerful role of local storytelling, whether that be in formal news or whether that be in the everyday conversations in the sorts of programs that aren't necessarily news and current affairs. They're very important. So the key challenges are communication and understanding, and that involves really balancing an understanding of the science, the community and the range of potential solutions, and then fostering action from those fundamentals, which take time to uncover. And we're really keen to work with the sector and with those communities to begin to develop those foundations. Next slide, please. So there's plenty of opportunities with climate change. We often hear about deficit and bad news, and that there is certainly challenges that lie ahead, but there are also opportunities. Communities have a role to play in mitigating and adapting to climate change, and in fact, their participation is absolutely critical. Climate challenge solutions are cost effective and many are available now and provide enormous opportunities. There's enormous opportunities for the sector to be involved in leading. I mean, the sector is well known for its capacity to care for vulnerable and marginalised communities, to be at the fore of responses in taking care of the sort of social, geographical and cultural diversity of Australia. And really climate change action requires the sector to bring that again to the fore of its responses. And it's certainly well renowned for that, and this is the reason why we're speaking to you today. There are opportunities for community radio stations, for individual stations, and for the entire network of community groups that use stations and the whole community broadcasting system in Australia. So there's plenty of, this is just an early conversation and plenty more conversations to be had. Next slide, please. Today, in the time that we have left, we want to talk to you about how you can become involved in the project, any feedback on what you are doing and what you would like to be doing, and what we could do to help you do that right now. So this is what we'd like to open the chat up to. The caveat is, of course, that there's a slide with Anne's contact details on it. So if something happens after the webinar, or you want to take it back to your station or to other people who you work with to discuss the potential of warming up, then please do contact Anne, and she'll make sure that we respond and get back to you with some either answers to your questions or responses to what you're already doing. So thanks everyone. I think that's it. And with that, we'll just open up to the floor, to the chat session, to for any questions or any feedback on warming up and what your stations are doing locally.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And as stated, if you just want to put anything into the chat box or into the Q&A, we'd love to have your questions there, any of them that you might have. We will, of course, have a recording of this available for everyone to view following the webinar. And apologies again for the technical difficulty there. I don't know if I've sort of eliminated the amount of people that there would have been there to ask questions, Bridget, Kerrie and Anne. Maybe I did it subconsciously because I didn't want anyone to have to ask any hard questions. I will ask a couple of the questions that we generally get. Would it be possible to grab a copy of today's presentation to send out to everyone following the webinar?
Sure, I'm happy to provide that to you, Danny, as soon as we're finished. And yeah, people are welcome to have a copy or to share a copy with people they think would be interested.
Excellent. And I also noted there throughout the webinar that Jordana Caputo, the CEO of the Community Media Training Organisation, put a link up for their emergency preparedness pathway course. There in reference to a few of the things you were saying. What I might do is I will just put the link for that back up into the webinar chat, because that is a very important thing. And indeed now might be the time to sort of talk about any other links that you might sort of want to connect there to people who are attending today's session.
And the links to the sources of reliable sources of climate change information might be useful to copy into the chat if possible.
Sure. I can't access the chat at the moment, so.
Sorry, yes, I'm able to put those things up into the chat for you.
That'd be great. Thanks, Danny.
I better do something useful after I sabotaged our webinar. Possibly I might be one of those people. I might be one of those people who are sort of against this climate change reporting thing, and this is sort of my way of doing that. That's sort of one of the questions that I often have when it comes to these sort of situations. Sort of, what do you do with pushback for people who sort of might be, I guess, skeptical of the effects of climate change? Is there a way to sort of like a real world example with which you can sort of confront someone and sort of say, well, you know, you might not listen to science, but what will you listen to? It might make you sort of care a bit more for our environment and this issue.
So Danny, there's been some really great work done by an Australian researcher who was at UQ and has moved to the States in the last little while, where I think he's really got his work cut out for him, because I know he's moving to COVID conspiracy theories now. And so he's done some really great work, not just kind of academic work, but some really nice work in terms of creating cartoons that are quite useful in describing some of these kind of pushback arguments that we get. And he talks about the 6 Americas, which, you know, are pretty similar to the 6 Australias. And they're about, you know, different types of arguments that you get, like conspiracy theories and things that you get in response to scientific arguments more generally. And they're similar for COVID just as they are similar for climate change and vaccination and a whole lot of other scientific areas. And so I'd encourage, and that's a really good link that we can add to, and I'd encourage people to have a look through those, because they talk about, false dichotomies. They talk about, a whole range of different typical arguments that people get and useful responses that people can make. And I think that's a great place to start, because, especially as we come up to Christmas, and John Cook has called this the Cranky Uncle series. And he says it's a bit like everyone's got a cranky uncle that they deal with at Thanksgiving or Christmas, that they get, buttonhole to talk to about climate change, over the turkey. So we'll put that link up, and I think people might find that useful, and that's certainly something that we're planning to go through in the project as well, because it's quite useful.
I think Gemma Purves has probably worded my question much better than I could.
Okay.
And she asks sort of, how are you raising these issues without alienating your audience?
I think I'll just have a go at this one. I think it's a really good question, Gemma, and it's one that we're conscious of, in having these like difficult conversations that you have locally. When the data shows that repeated surveys show that around about 2/3 of Australians believe that climate change is happening and it's anthropogenic. So that's good news, in terms of the number of people that you're going to encounter like that. But I guess in part the point of our project is to speak with you about how, if you have an older or more conservative audience in a regional part of Australia, or as opposed to an urban part of Australia, the idea is to work with you to develop, campaigns and strategies that are less likely to alienate your audience. And there's different sort of broad-based strategies that we can use. That might be a matter of thinking about heat stress in older people and climate change, and focusing more on those health impacts, and then allowing local people or older people to tell those stories, picking up on what Bridget was talking about, local stories. So there's a myriad of ways in which that might happen, and it's just not a cookie cutter approach. We need to be and too often communication, and this is what you're picking up on too, Gemma, I think, is too often communication is seen as the easy bit, like, we'll get all these ideas together and then we'll just find a way to communicate it, that'll be easy. But what we are seeing in locally, nationally and internationally in climate change communication is actually the hard bit. Communication is difficult, and we need to be thoughtful and strategic in the way in which we design messaging for different audiences in different places, so that it will resonate with them and reach its target. So that's the idea of working locally with these community stations, is to tell stories and to build capacity to allow these things to happen. The other thing that I'd say, just finally, before throwing to Bridget and is that there is a danger in, I think, and you'd know it yourself, in avoiding climate change, climate science conversations. Sticking to your expertise. What we're giving you there is a whole range of places where there is reputable science, but as we know, for some people that just won't be enough. So there are ways in which we can bypass that by having different community-led conversations. And I'll just throw to Bridget or Anne to add anything else to that really important question.
I'll have a go next. I think too, it's a matter of focusing on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve having a community that's better prepared for a particular impact, then the conversation doesn't even need to be about climate change. And so sometimes just focusing on, okay, and taking the example of heat stress, if you want people to better understand what the heat stress risks are for this summer and what they can do about it, then let's talk about that. We might at some point mention that, this is likely to be getting worse because of climate change, but that would be a judgment call of whether that's actually going to be useful or not. But basically, it's about how to help people survive heat stress this summer.
Definitely. Yeah. I think also it is about thinking about the language that you're using too. I mean, if you know that climate change is going to be a bit of a dog whistle in your community, you know, recalling Greta Thunberg and the, you know, long-haired hippies who block traffic in the city, you've really got to just think about what is going to be more relevant to your community, whether it's talking about heat stress rather than climate change, or drought, or, you know, cyclones. These are things that are happening, but you can be quite, I guess, strategic in how you frame them if you are facing or up against some sort of conservative, more resistant audiences. So really thinking about the kind of language that you're using and how you frame those discussions.
And let's not avoid that complexity. You know, let's not avoid that and say, oh, we're just going to ignore it. You know, we clearly can't ignore it. Let's like really delve deep into what that might look for an older or conservative audience, and wherever they might be, and just do our best to support, whether we call it climate. I know that the work that Anne and I've done in some remote Indigenous locations up in the far north on climate change adaptation, we spoke about land and sea changes rather than climate changes, because, you know, climate change is Western science, whether land and sea changes is something that people in those communities were very familiar with, but weren't calling it climate change. So there's, you know, various ways in which we might enter those communication strategies and those stories, and we just have to think about it before we rush in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, all of you, for speaking on that one. I've often sort of found that it's probably the most difficult thing for stations to engage with. I mean, I think I believe there is a perception of the community broadcasting sector where it is sort of, I guess, a bit leftist, but if you really drill down on it, it's a fairly broad church, very much across the board there, as to the sort of people creating community radio. And of course, it's obviously reflective of the Australian community, but I think there is also, as you state, the need there, then, that recognition that climate is changing, and we do have that duty to report on it. Thank you to Emma Ramsey for her comment there, saying fantastic content and science in this webinar. Stations need this great support in addressing a really complex issue. Thank you, Emma. Anyone else have any questions there? Please feel free to put them through to us via the Zoom webinar chat. Might I just apologise again for that glitch in our webinar that dropped everyone out there briefly. These things do happen. Did I mention 2020? Yep, 2020. Well, with that, I think this is going to be sort of the first discussion of a much, much longer conversation. If anyone does have any queries, they can please feel free to. I'll put my email address into the chat box as well, and you can get in touch with me that way, and I will in turn relay that to our presenters. But I noticed that Anne has got her email address up there, and I would very much encourage you to make contact with her in regards to this. But yeah, I think this is sort of just going to be the first conversation of a lot of this, and sort of coming up to summer, we obviously really hope that things are going to be all right, but if last year taught us anything, it's that we need to be eternally vigilant in regards to all of this. People are also encouraged to sort of see previous CBAA webinars on emergency broadcasting and emergency preparedness for more insight into this. So I'll send a few of those links to all registrants today as part of our follow-up. But I'm not seeing any more questions come through. And as such, I might bring things to a close. Can I just say a big thanks to Kerrie, Anne and Bridget for taking the time today to have this chat with us. It is absolutely wonderful to have such knowledgeable people providing their insight into this. With any luck, we'll be hearing from them again here via our CBAA webinar platform. That's all right, I got smiles from all three of you.
You certainly will be hearing from us. We can't wait to get started. Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Obviously, this is about climate change and not contract law, but I'm assuming that we've got a verbal contract now. I'm making sure you will come back.
We will.
Thanks very much to everyone who attended today's session. Wonderful to have you here. A recording of this will be made available shortly after. Please do feel free to get in touch with us in regards to this issue. More news about the Warming Up project will be coming your way really soon. This is Danny Shively on behalf of the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. We'll see you soon.